Hi everybody, happy Poetry Month. Today to celebrate, I want to talk about verse novels or novels in verse and some poetry collections. Verse novels, novels in verse, just like what they sound like. These are stories, they are novels. They have characters, plot, things happen. This one is called Voices, The Final Hours of Joan of Arc. It's by David Elliott. It actually has some cool concrete poetry, so it's in different shapes. So it's actually historical fiction written in verse. So written as poetry, but meant to be read like a novel. This is a book about this character. His name is Michael. He is a gay teen heading off to college and trying to figure out who he is. This one is Clapping Land by Elizabeth Acevedo. It's about two sisters, half-sisters, who learn about each other after their father dies in a plane crash. Seems like a hefty book, but it's all poetry. That being said, you can read it straight through just like you would read any novel. And because it is poems, verse novels tend to read pretty quickly. Poetry collections. This is more so what we might think of when we talk about poetry. These poems, while connected to each other, they may be about the same theme, have some of the same topics that they talk about. This is not a story. There aren't usually characters. There's not really a plot in a collection of poems. Each poem is its own thing. A poetry collection is maybe more like an album, like music that you read. But I don't generally recommend reading a book of poetry front to back in the same way that you would a verse novel. Because poems can be dense, a lot of emotions in poems, so it can be hard to sit down and read, even though these are usually quite a bit shorter than verse novels. It can be hard to read this in one afternoon because there's a lot of emotion in these. If the theme is recognizing who you are and coming to terms with your identities, let's say. In the beginning, it may be a lot of confusion, and then towards the end, it's an acceptance of your identity. So we've got Somebody Give This Heart a Pen. We have When the World Didn't End, and The Princess Saves Herself in this one. We have physical copies of verse novels, of poetry collections. You can, of course, read poems on a page, but I will always recommend getting the audiobook version or finding a recording of the poem that you are going to read. Poetry is very, very similar to music, very similar to songs. I wouldn't recommend that you read song lyrics. You can, people do, but the way that it is meant to be enjoyed or experienced is through hearing it. And I think poetry is very similar in that way. I think poetry sounds better than it looks a lot of the times, the same way that songs sound better than they look. And you also get usually the author's tone and inflection and things like that in a way that you don't when you read it on a page. The library does have audiobook versions of many verse novels and poetry collections. Another thing you can do is go to YouTube, search the author, search the poet, and quite often, even if they don't have an entire recording of the collection of the book, you will be able to hear the poet perform several of their poems. Those are the biggest similarities and differences, I would say, between verse novels and poetry collections. So we've got plot, we've got characters, we've got stories, novels, and then we've got collections, which are more like listening to a song here and there. You may not read an entire collection in an afternoon. You might dip in and out of it, read it out of order, but both use the format of poetry, which is what we're celebrating in the month of April. So whatever you want to read, whatever type of reading adventure you're looking for, we've got something for you. Happy reading, happy listening, and thank you for watching.